Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this, the first of the College Lecturers' Day 2020 webinars. My name is Helen Brooks. I'm one of the Senior Behaviour Insights Managers at AHDB. So welcome, everyone. Thank you all for registering and attending. We know that your time is precious, so thank you for spending the time with us today. We're going to be, today's is the first of 4 webinars happening over today and tomorrow. So this webinar, we're going to be looking at industry updates, looking at the environment, about Brexit, and also about the range of market updates that we currently have at AHDB. So the aim of this webinar is very much to give you some industry updates, updates on some of the research that we've been doing throughout AHDB, and also signpost to some of our tools and resources that hopefully you all do make use of, but also to make sure you have those updates. As I said, this is the first of 4 webinars. As some of you will know, we do tend to have a physical event, but the delights of COVID have hampered that for this year. So we have this webinar this morning. We also have one this afternoon focusing on the livestock sector. So that starts at 2 p.m. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock we have the Arable focus, and 2 p.m. tomorrow afternoon is the business focus. If you haven't already registered for those, I would urge you to do so, as there's still time to register. So just some housekeeping rules. You will all be muted throughout the whole of the webinar, and we are aiming to finish the webinar at around about 11:30. Please ensure that, to make sure that you get the benefit of the webinar, make sure your laptops are plugged in. We don't want to lose any of you halfway through if that's not doable. So there is, after each section, there is a question and answer opportunity for everyone. So please feel free to pop in your questions into the Q&A. So you have access to that. I think it's on the right hand side of your screen. You should see the functionality for the questions and answers. So please do pop those questions in for the presenters. You can also use that section for if you have any technical issues. So if you're having any technical issues regarding sound or the presentation moving on, or any issues, then please feel free to pop in those questions in that area as well. So as I said, we've got 2 speakers for you this morning. We have Sarah Baker and Hannah Clark. We will have questions and answers after each of the sessions. If we don't get round to the questions during the time allowed, then we will make sure that all questions are answered in our FAQs, which will be circulated after the event with the email and the videos of the session. At the end of the session, you'll also be prompted to answer a survey, but again, that will be circulated in the follow-up email should you not have the opportunity to do it then. But we do obviously really value your feedback and all the input and time that you offer us. So on to our first speaker. So I'd like to introduce Sarah Baker, one of our senior strategic insight managers from AHDB. Sarah's actually doing 2 presentations for us today, but the first one is with regards to updates on environmental management and practice and the related schemes. So I will hand over to Sarah and join you back at the Q&A shortly afterwards.
Thank you very much, Helen, and good morning, everybody. As Helen said, I'm going to give you a brief update on the environmental land management schemes, or ELMs as they're commonly referred to, mainly around timings, what we do know, what we don't know, and what to expect going forward. Next slide, please. So it's well understood that direct payments are going to be phased out over a 7-year period. The first reduction is going to be next year, 2021, and we know the reduction for the first year. So for the first 30,000 of any direct payment, recipients will lose 5%, between 30 and 50, 10%, 50 and 150, 20, and then 150 and above will lose a quarter of their direct payment. So that's sort of a tiered system, if you like, similar to income tax. That the more you're getting in direct payments, that the higher bands will lose proportionately more. What we don't know is after tier 1, after year one, how the reductions will go. So for all of our analysis, we've assumed a straight line analysis. Now, the legal position on that is that the government have stated if they feel they're being reduced too quickly, they can halt the reduction for a number of years and then carry on. But I think it's reasonable to assume a straight line reduction after year one, and in 2028 there won't be any direct payments. During that period, it's called the agricultural transition period, slightly confusingly. So it's not the EU-UK transition period, it's the agriculture policy transition period. They will be testing elm. So as you probably know, there have been a lot of sort of tests and pilots going on over the last couple of years. From 2021, the national pilot will begin to be rolled out. Now, they'll be taking sign up from January, and farmers will be able to sort of sign up to be as part of the sort of national testing scheme from January. However, it's not until 2024 that the environmental land management contracts are actually launched. So it's not full national rollout until 2024. What that means is for the period 2021 to 2024, you've got a situation where direct payments are being reduced, but unless you're in the pilot scheme, there won't be any money coming through from environmental land management contracts. So I often hear the argument, but the government have guaranteed that the pot of money will be the same. Well, yes, they have, but what they've said is that all the money that comes out of direct payments are going to go into the national pilot and or associated schemes. So it doesn't mean that the same people that are losing direct payments are going to be the same people that receive payments through ELM. So what you need to do as a business, or what farmers need to do as a business, is really look how this is going to affect them as individuals. And for that, I would direct them to the AHDB website and the business impact calculator, where they can put in their direct payments and work out exactly what they're going to get over the next 7 years. So in the meantime, the agri-environmental schemes that are currently running will be continued. So if farmers are in a countryside stewardship or a higher level stewardship, that they will continue to get these sort of Pillar 2 type fundings direct from UK government. Okay, next slide, please. So what does ELMS consist of, and how does it differ from direct payments? Well, instead of automatically getting a payment for an area of land that you're farming, and in effect, apart from some cross-compliance and apart from some sort of rules that you have to adhere to, you get that money based on area. This is money for doing something. So what is a public good? Well, you probably know this, your college lecturers. A public good is a good that we can't create a market for, i.e. we can't buy and sell. And the reasons we can't do that is because we can't exclude people once it's provided. So clean air, if you haven't paid your taxes, you can't say, I'm sorry, but you're not allowed to breathe. The same with clean water. I mean, you can to an extent because there are meters and so on. And flood prevention, if if you don't contribute to the flood prevention, we can't make a little hole in the wall so your home gets flooded and nobody else's. So the looking after the soils, the looking after the environment, the looking after the clean air, the clean water, these are all things that farmers do, but they don't get rewarded through the market system for. So ELM is intended to address that market failure, if you like, and provide public money for these public goods. So things that have been included in the sort of slightly wider definition of public goods, slightly wider than the economic definition, are managing land and water in a way that protects or improves the environment, supporting public access to the countryside, farming or woodland, and better understanding of the environment, mitigating or adapting to climate change. That's a huge one. As we know, we have a target for emissions for net zero with the 25-year environment plan, preventing, reducing or protecting from environmental hazards, health and welfare of livestock, and protecting, improving the health of plants. So that's your sort of public goods, if you like, that they've been clearly defined as public goods and things that the government are intending to support through ELM. In addition, there will be money to improve the productivity of the industry. We all know that UK agriculture gains in productivity have lagged behind some of our European and our global competitors. So that can't be blamed necessarily on the Common Agricultural Policy, because countries like the Netherlands, who are under exactly the same scheme, have made faster gains in productivity than we have here in the UK. So a focus on productivity, and that needs to be very carefully conveyed to the industry, because whenever people start talking productivity, farmers assume we mean greater yields. What we mean is getting the same yields from fewer inputs, or getting more from slightly more inputs. So improving that input-output ratio to improve our productivity. There's also going to be investment in research and development to push the scientific frontiers forward. And there's also going to be support for farmers during the transition, this 7-year transition period. Next slide, please. Just while we wait for the next slide, I think they've frozen slightly. Bear with me. I'll talk about the next slide while we sort out the slides, and it's important to note that, thank you, it's important to note that agriculture is a devolved responsibility, and therefore ELM is a England only policy that comes from Westminster. In Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, the devolved governments will be responsible for agricultural policy going forward. So in Scotland, they have a stability and simplicity proposals, and they're very much looking to a transition period that starts in 2024. So from the period 2021-2024, when the England will be undergoing the beginning of the transition, Scotland will be maintaining the status quo. So minimal changes from CAP, apart from the fact that now Scottish Government would be paying farmers that money. And farmers and crofters who receive direct payments will continue to be supported, but beyond 2024, a new policy period, and you can look at those recommendations within stability and simplicity. But I think a focus on the environment is a common thread that runs through all the devolved policies. Next slide, please. So equally in Wales, the Welsh Government's proposed scheme, Restoring Biodiversity, they are aiming to reward farmers from sustainable land management. So again, similar to ELM, but sustainable land management and a longer transition period. Fewer details on the Welsh and Scottish. Northern Ireland are maintaining the status quo for the time being. They are slightly more complicated because of the Northern Ireland Protocol. So they're going to stay within the framework of CAP for the time being, with Northern Ireland paying. Next slide, please. As soon as more information becomes available on these devolved policies, and indeed on the English policy, we will be making those available. But for the meantime, this slide just very quickly shows the dependence on direct payments for a lot of our sectors. As you can see, grazing livestock, almost all of their farm business income is made up of direct payments. So if you start taking that away, and at the moment we don't know the extent to which ELMS will replace those payments, you can see that the industry is significantly going to suffer that direction. Pigs and poultry and horticulture are probably the least dependent on direct payments, and we know that there are sort of more commercial, more business focused. People don't tend to be in pigs, poultry or hortic for a lifestyle choice. They're more sort of commercial, scaled up enterprises, but there will still be opportunities for those business through ELMS, and it's important that those operators keep an eye on what the pilot scheme consists of and how they can contribute and access some of those funds. For the cereals and grazing livestock, I would say it's incredibly important that farmers now need to look very carefully through those pilot schemes and look at how they can best participate and how their businesses will be affected, because we're asking farmers not now just to be excellent farmers. We're asking them now to be environmental specialists, to be incredibly good business managers, to be change managers, to be people managers. A lot of changes coming down the pipeline for farming, and here at AHDB it's our main purpose to ensure that the industry is ready for that. Next slide, please. So what does Elm look like? Well, at the moment, we know that it will be in 3 tiers. The first tier is a sort of entry level, and that will be a farm level, which it's envisaged that all current farmers will be able to access. And farmers will be paid to employ or continue practices which are beneficial to the environment or improve sustainability. So things like using cover crops, using wildflower meadows, improving drainage, that sort of thing that they're already paid for. What we don't know yet are the proportion of the pot that's going towards each tier, but tier 1 will be an entry level, and hopefully all farmers will be able to access that. Advice will be available on the government websites before the national pilot. Tier 2 is a sort of local level, and this requires collaboration between farmers and other land managers, and these will be focused on locally targeted environmental outcomes. And things like the nitrate vulnerable zones, that are currently in operation, things like localized flood protection, and local schemes that require more than just one farmer to participate in, and then up to tier 3, which are a true landscape level schemes, things that will actually change the sort of the landscape of the UK, and these will be focused on carbon storage, and there'll be peatland restoration, wetland creation, afforestation, and those sort of major changes that require great collaboration. The important thing to remember is that Elm will be available to all land managers. So again, that pot of money that's been guaranteed isn't now just for farming. It will include the major landowners that aren't currently farming, so that the highways, the land that's held in local authorities, railways, that sort of land will be able to participate in these schemes. Next slide, please. So that's just given you a very brief run through what we know and what we don't know about Elm coming up. The key message for farmers here from AHDB is to find out as much as you possibly can, really understand how it's going to affect your individual business, and do everything you can to prepare for that potential loss of income as the direct payments start reducing from 2021 onwards. So that's the message that we want to convey. We also want to convey that there's a huge amount of support and information available on our websites, and as soon as any more information becomes available, either on the English policy or on the devolved nations policy, we will be writing about that, and that will be on our website too. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much for that, Sarah. I think it's clear to see that it is a developing picture, and one that AHDB are keeping close, and your team are keeping close to. So really good to have that insight currently. We've got a couple of questions coming in, so please feel free, everyone, to put your questions on the Q&A function. We'll start with the first one that's come through, which is, will the Agri environment scheme be running in Scotland and Wales until 2024? Most schemes appear to be currently closed, so presumably not.
I know they will be in England. I understand that they will be continuing in Scotland and Wales, but there may be new schemes opening from the beginning of 2021. So in the same way that the pilot is opening in England in 2021, I think there's a view that these tier 2 type policies should be continued, because the important thing is that the environmental work doesn't stop between now and 2024, and that also that nobody that is in one of those environmental type schemes, that the stewardship schemes, is penalised as we transition to new policy. So my understanding, and I will go away and double check this and find out where you can get the information from, is that those environmental schemes will be available in the devolved nations going forward until they start their transition.
Brilliant. Another question that's come through is regarding how welfare will be managed and monitored as part of the ELMS. Do we know anything about that at the moment, Sarah, in terms of welfare?
It's a very delicate subject because of the trade negotiations and so on. Now, the UK has one of the highest welfare standards in the world. We all know that. We all have, and there's clear legislation in place in order to protect animals through the rearing, slaughtering, and processing processes. So it's something that has been put in the public goods, in the public feel very strongly about it, and therefore it's something that is now clearly in Elm as a public good, and should be rewarded, because to maintain higher welfare standards is often a costly exercise. As the pig farmers know, when we dispense with sow stalls, it costs the farmer money to maintain very high animal welfare standards, and if which we can't under WTO, if we can't keep product out that are produced to lower standards, then in order to create a level playing field, domestic producers need to be compensated for reaching those higher welfare standards. Now, as far as trade goes, in under WTO rules, if you can't determine in the final product a difference, then you can't discriminate against it, and therefore it's very hard to determine welfare standards on WTO rules. But what you can do is you can set your own standards within free trade deals, and the government's been very clear about that. It's said that it's not going to allow product in that's produced to lower welfare standards, or to goods that are produced in ways that are not acceptable to the public. So the hormone treated beef, for instance. So welfare will be enshrined in ELMS, and there will be some form of support towards protecting and supporting farmers that strive for higher welfare. And I would envisage a sort of basic standard, pretty much where we are now, which is very, very high, if you like, so a very high basic standard, and then additional payments for any bespoke schemes that may or may not come into creation. But at the moment, the detail is very lacking, so I can't tell you any detail on that, but that's the basic framework under which the government's operating.
That's brilliant, thank you, Sarah. And I think it's one of those things. Obviously, AHDB is passionate about welfare, and our R&D teams are doing an awful lot of work on it at the moment. So hopefully the two will come together in the near future. Next question that's come in is there likely to be sufficient funding for all land managers to sign up in 2024, or will it be assessed on an individual basis?
Now, again, that's a question that I can't answer at the moment. Obviously, what was planned and what will come into reality are always two different things. My understanding is that anybody who is eligible, i.e. any land manager, any farm manager, will be allowed to sign up to the scheme. I think that the question is how much funding will then be put behind that scheme, and if everybody signs up, how much will each individual get, and also how much is available to each tier. So how much will be at the sort of grassroots level, the tier 1, and how much will be reserved for the tier 2, tier 3, and what level of skill will it require to access those tier 3 schemes where a lot of the money may be. So and again, with regard to that pot of money, we all know what COVID has done to the national economy. We all know that a huge amount of money has been spent, and we all know that although we're not going to return to austerity, and we have lots of reassurances about that, we can all sort of safely assume that money will be fairly tight going forward. So I would, as a farmer, I would count on my direct payments disappearing. Well, we know that's going to happen in 2027, but not assume that they are going to be replaced by ELM. Therefore, err on the side of caution, and then any money that does come in from ELM is, if you like, is in addition to what you've planned for. And our analysis shows that the top 25% of performers in every sector will still be profitable without those environmental landscape, without those direct payments. So even though I showed you that slide that showed dependence on direct payments, and we saw that cereals and grazing livestock are very vulnerable to their reduction, they are average farms. So your top performers farms will still be profitable without direct payments. What you then need to do as a business is look very carefully at the characteristics of those top 25%, which are available on the AHDB website if you just Google characteristics of top performers, AHDB, and then see what changes are within your gift to make on your business so that you can get yourself into that top tier. In that way, you will still remain profitable as direct payments disappear, and any extra income that you do gain from ELMS will only be a benefit to your business. And I think that's the sort of conservative, sort of frugal response that I would make as a business to these changes, in the absence of more information about exactly what the level of funding will be.
That's brilliant. And I suppose sort of leading on from that question, almost you touched on, you know, who's going to be eligible, but are there going to be any geographic restrictions with regards to tier 2 and 3 that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of at the moment. I think as we envisage it, if you think of tier 3 as landscape, you often hear about the wild and beautiful. They were mentioned in Health and Harmony, the wild and beautiful parts of the UK. So you think about the national parks and you think about the uplands. But equally, if we're talking carbon storage, which we are predominantly with tier 3, we're also talking peat bogs, we're also talking grassland. So I can see that extending over most parts of the UK. I think some of the devolved nations have disproportionately more agricultural land than England. So it'd be very interesting to see how their policies evolve over the time.
That's brilliant. A question has come in regarding the LEADER scheme finishing. Which grants, will the LEADER scheme finish, which funds grants for smaller capital expenditure and which are decided locally at county level? The LEADER grants have been seen as being helping productivity. Have you got much information on the LEADER scheme, Sarah?
I haven't got much information on the LEADER scheme, but I do know that that there's a productivity grant scheme now available for farmers to sign up to that looks to. It sounds very similar. It sounds as if it is for things like buildings and infrastructure for individual farmers. But no, I'd have to go away and find that out for you and have a look on our website and see if any more information is available. But I'm afraid I can't answer that one.
No, that's fine. What we can do, as I said at the beginning, we will be sending around an FAQ. So what we'll do is we'll ask Sarah and her team just have a little bit of a look around with regards to the LEADER scheme and try and send some links that will be helpful to the whole of the audience. So good question, and we will follow up on that one.
Yeah, will do.
There is another question come in. So the ELMS is being badged as being designed in collaboration with the industry. Do we have any evidence that this is happening, and how?
At the moment, we have the sort of testing system going on. So they DEFRA are working very closely with individual farmers and testing some of these schemes and listening very carefully to the feedback. I think some of the consultation and some of the sort of large farmer meetings have been affected by the COVID situation. But I would see the participation in the national pilot as being your opportunity, if you like, to feed into this scheme. So from 2021 onwards, then we sort of scale up the pilot, and it's at that time that these schemes are really going to be tested for their practicality and their effectiveness and their efficiency. So I think it's at that point that the true consultation will happen, and the things that have been tested on a smaller scale, have a look and see if it's possible to scale those up to a national scale very quickly and effectively. So I think I see 2021 and 2024 as to see the broader based consultation. And up until 2021, you're right, as individual farmers, you may not have heard an awful lot about it. It's been predominantly the sort of only those involved in the pilots that have been able to feed back at this stage. There was, of course, the consultation period on the entire proposals, which anybody could feed into. So there has been considerable consultation along the way and with key stakeholders. So you can engage via the NFU or as regards influencing the policy and so on, and we will make all the information available. But I'd strongly encourage you to go on the DEFRA website and get yourself up to speed for a January application.
That's brilliant. And just one final quick question as to whether you actually think that ELMS will replace direct payments.
Now, I'm probably out of step with a lot of people on this question. This is my personal view. I don't have I don't have any evidence to support this, but I don't think that the new environmental land management schemes will be anywhere near as generous as the Common Agriculture Policy. I think for 40 years we've benefited from being part of a large trading group with relatively protectionist trade policies, or highly protectionist trade policies, and fairly generous farm support, thanks to very strong farming lobbies in across Europe. And I think we need to move to a system more akin to New Zealand and Australia, where the subsidies are much less generous, and the money that farmers do get, they need to do something for. So there's an income foregone. It actually costs them something to participate in these elm scheme in terms of lost production, how much money you're going to put into elms. Obviously, you won't be growing a crop on it or producing animals on it, so there will be a loss involved. So I would. I don't think that they will replace direct payments or anywhere near, and I think that's an urgent message that needs to be conveyed to industry.
That's brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Sarah, and thank you for that presentation and for the questions. Now, Sarah's actually our second presenter as well, so I will just let her have a quick sip of drink before we go into the second presentation. So Sarah's second presentation is really an update on all things Brexit. So as we're all aware, this is an ever-changing landscape. And Sarah did put the caveat when she sent us the slides before the weekend that there could even be changes over the weekend. So this is very much as up to date as AHDB have the information at the moment. So I will hand back over to Sarah. As always, please keep the questions coming in. If you've got any questions regarding Sarah's last presentation, feel free to send them in and we will address them in the FAQ. But any questions regarding Brexit and Sarah's update on it would be gratefully received. So I will hand back over to Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you for that quick sip of tea. Yes, I'm afraid it's me again for the next 20 minutes. So as Helen said, the EU exit update is a movable feast, and things indeed have moved on over the weekend. So I will take you through my slides, but I'll also give you the sort of latest information that I have available as well. So next slide, please. So as you all know, we started the sort of the EU exit transition period, if you like, from January. We've actually left the EU. So if you like, Brexit in its truest form has been done. We're no longer a member of the EU, but we have this 12-month transition period during which predominantly to negotiate a free trade agreement or a future relationship with the EU. And those negotiations began in March. So the timetable was already tight. We had 9 months to agree a free trade agreement. Admittedly, there was precedent. We've been trading with the EU for 40 years, but clearly there was a lot at stake in negotiating a free trade agreement in a very short space of time. Up to now, there have been 9 formal rounds of negotiation, and there's been a lot of progress on trading goods and services, but the sticking points remain fisheries, the EU's access to UK fishing water, the level playing field, and what that means is the amount of support that businesses get in order to create a fair and even trade platform. So for instance, if EU farmers were in receipt of much more generous support schemes than UK farmers, you can see already there would be an effect on their ability to trade. That's been a key sticking point. And the governance, the extent to which the UK will allow the EU rulings to dictate UK policy. So the latest developments that aren't quite the latest developments. The European Council noted there wasn't enough progress, but asked for negotiations to continue. And on the 16th, which was Boris's deadline, if you like, there was a lot of theatre, and he just said, get ready for no deal, because it looks like the EU aren't prepared to negotiate a deal. After that, the EU took quite a firm stance at their meeting of heads of, and I think Macron is noted for his sort of hardline stance. The others are slightly more willing to reach a compromise. So the trade deals have begun to reconvened last week, last Thursday. Michel Barnier came over to the UK. He was due to go back at the weekend, but he stayed, and he is staying until Wednesday, and then the negotiations are going to relocate to Brussels. So it's clear that something is happening at the moment, and a lot of talk behind the scenes is that a deal will be struck before the 31st. But we have the time against us. Next slide, please. We have this ticking clock, which means that we have an incredibly tight timescale. It has to be agreed by the 31st of October, otherwise there isn't time to ratify it. And although there is some narrative to say, can we go to the next slide, please? Although there is some narrative to say that that things may extend beyond the 31st of October, I think that's a sort of a bit of a lazy narrative, if you know, if you understand what I mean. I think we're used to the rabbit being pulled out of the hat at the last moment with the EU, but this one, in order to get things in time, I think at least an agreement in principle should be reached by the 31st. I think we're clearly having some problems with the slides. So what I wanted to go on and talk about really is what this means for UK agriculture. So we'll let the slides catch. Oh, here we go. So what does this mean? We've got just under 10 more weeks now to keep talking, and as I said, this slide has probably been superseded, actually, from what I've just said. Just what's happened last week and this weekend, that the Brexit talks are back on. So here it says they're off for the time being, but they are now back on, and on with a vengeance. So as you can see, these slides needed quite a lot of updating last week and still aren't bang up to date. Okay, next slide, please. So what does this mean for UK agriculture? Again, I'll talk ahead of and allow the slides time to catch up. Oh, here we go. The risk of no deal increases as we get closer to that deadline, because that really is quite a firm deadline. A trade deal is still preferable for everybody because we've been part of this single market, and they're our largest trading partner and have been for the last 40 years. So what that means is that to trade without tariffs and without duty is essential to remain competitive, both ways, in fairness, but particularly in the UK for things like lamb that go over to the EU. If they were to be to face with a tariff selling lamb into the EU, it means that they would be uncompetitive overnight, and the trade would drop significantly, and we would see huge price decreases in the range of 25 to 30% here on domestic lamb prices, which coupled with the loss of direct payments, as we saw in the previous presentation, it is two major shocks to a certain industry in the sector, which would be difficult to weather. Also, striking a trade deal will mean there'll be a reduction of the regulatory hurdles, i.e. the rate of physical inspection at the border. Although, as we're trading as a third country, we still will have to have physical checks, and that's going to introduce quite an amount of trade friction, and that will add cost to our trade. The important thing is, if we have a trade deal, those inspections will be less. They won't be at every single load, so those trade frictions will be reduced somehow. But either way, although the trade deal is still preferable, change is coming. As I said, the UK will no longer be part of the single market, and there's unavoidable changes in the way that we trade. Next slide, please. So, do we crash out and trade with the EU on World Trade Organization terms? These are often spoken about. If we do, the World Trade Organization is the global organization that sort of oversees global trade, and its main reason for existence is to facilitate trade, to encourage trade, because it's well known that global trade boosts economic development and economic growth, and that's beneficial for everybody. So if we can trade things that we have a comparative advantage in producing, and not produce others, buy other things that we don't have a comparative advantage in, then everybody benefits in theory. If we trade on WTO terms, as I said, the EU has quite a protectionist trade regime, which means that it has high external tariffs. in order to prevent third parties accessing those markets in the absence of a trade deal. So the UK will be facing for the first time those very high hurdles, if you like, to get over. And in lamb, they can be as high as 76%. I'll show you a slide that shows the tariffs. Beef, they're very high. Some of a lot of the livestock products, they are considerably high. But equally, we've had a new UK global tariff announced back in October, early October, and we've pretty much mirrored the EU common external tariff to all extent and purposes, with just a little bit of rounding and some sort of slight simplifications. But the UK now has a strong external tariff which EU farmers will have to face when sending product over to here. So that means that there'll be disruption and delays for exports. The pattern of trade may well change in the absence of a free trade deal, and there'll be these technical restrictions on EU trade, which the UK side have agreed to sort of suspend for the first 3 months, but that hasn't been reciprocated on the EU side. So that means that in theory, every single load coming across from the EU from the 1st of Jan will be checked for health certificates, export certificates, all the different paperwork, the sanitary and phytosanitary standards and the certification, and that could be devastating because a lot of agricultural trade is in perishable goods, and any delay or hold up in import can lead to either a reduction in value or indeed the loss of the entire load. Next slide, please. So we've been looking at this since 2016, along with some other leading academics at Newcastle University and the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute over in Northern Ireland. So 3 major studies came out in and around 2017, 2018, 2019, and then we updated our study again in 2019 to assess in 2020 actually, to assess the effect of the UK global tariff. Next slide, please. We all came to broadly the same conclusions, which is always incredibly encouraging when you're undertaking econometric modelling, because it is complex and it isn't meant to represent a forecast. It's meant to show where the landing zone could be and what could happen if various scenarios came into being. So if we get a free trade agreement, that caused the smallest changes to price and farm business income, but trade friction in the range of sort of 8% for livestock products down to about sort of 4 to 5% for crops was still significant. Trading under WTO terms caused much larger price and income changes, and the direction of change depends on whether the sector is a net importer or a net exporter. So for lamb, where we export a great deal of product across to the EU, we would see significant price decreases. And for things like pork, where we import a significant, or potatoes, processed potatoes, significantly import from the EU, we might see a price rise and therefore an opportunity for UK producers to displace some of that imported product. But in all scenarios, the access and cost of labour was a major factor to those farm business incomes and their competitiveness, and the domestic agricultural policy in many cases had a larger impact on farm business incomes than those trade scenarios. Next slide, please. So this is the UK global tariff compared to the EU common external tariff, and as you can see, it's pretty similar. It's been changed, it's been tweaked here and there, but they're pretty similar, and they're significant. There's not many producers that could deal with a sort of 40-50% tariff overnight and still remain competitive. So it's incredibly complex. There are different tariffs for each different product line. They're all available on the AHDB website and on the UK Gov website. But if you look at those, beef up to 70%, and sheep generally 40 to 50% on the carcasses. But again, on the high value cuts, they go up to the 70s. These are huge, so we're not talking a minor barrier to trade. Okay, next slide, please. We've modelled the effect of this 2020 UK global tariff, and here we have the impact. So 2019, we had a tariff regime announced in the event of no deal then that was actually offered very little protection to UK agriculture, and that's reflected in the second column here, and in the third column is the UK global tariff. So you can see significant changes there. So potatoes, for instance, we see a price rise on average. Now that's because we import a significant amount of processed product across from the Netherlands and Belgium, and therefore there's an opportunity there if we grow more processing varieties here in the UK to displace some of that product. But again, that's an average figure. If we look at the ability to grow the processing varieties, that opportunity doesn't avail itself of growers in Scotland and so on, where seed potatoes are the major problem. And seed potatoes we export, and in the absence of a free trade deal with the EU, they will be negatively affected. So again, within the sort of average scenarios, you have to look at individual businesses. Beef, again, there's an opportunity to displace some of the Irish beef that's coming in, and the same with pigs, to replace some of the pork that's currently imported from the EU. And sheep, as you can see that we're a net exporter, there'd be a dramatic decrease in the price of sheep. Now the reason we haven't gone out with these scenarios, if you like, is we feel here at AHDB that first, there isn't enough information available yet about what governments might do with tariff rate quotas or with a temporary suspension of the UK global tariff in the event of no trade deal with the EU. Although we have evidence to suggest that commodity price rises have very little effect on food prices because of the main value in food on supermarket shelves is in the processing, the packaging, the transport, the retail share. Nonetheless, I think government is very keen and has made it very clear that it's keen to avoid food price inflation, particularly as we're heading into a recession, because that is very regressive and has a very detrimental effect on the public. So it may well be that the government will temporarily suspend tariffs, although we have no information at the moment to suggest that they would. But in addition, we have these trade deals that are being negotiated at the moment and can be finalised after the 31st of December with three major agricultural exporters, and they are the Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. And therefore, if product starts coming in from these major exporters, we can see that these price gains might very quickly be eroded. Now, just a quick note on sheep. The lamb that currently comes in from New Zealand already comes in under a tariff rate quota, so already comes in free of any UK global tariff, and will continue to do so even if we don't strike a trade deal with the EU. Okay, next slide, please. So the key messages for these, it's a complex picture. If we do fail to reach a comprehensive trade deal with the EU, and we are trading under these UK global tariffs, there will be large price and income changes for UK farmers, but the effect will be transitory, because the UK has made it clear it's not seeking a protectionist trade stance. It wants to be a great trading nation. It wants to go down the route of the trading nations like New Zealand, Australia, and the US, and therefore we don't see that situation as being maintained for any length of time. The new trade deals will open up access to UK markets, and in many cases they may have an effect on prices. We will be looking very closely at these once we have the relationship between the EU and the UK finalised. We can then go on to model, as we have done in the past, the effect of future trade deals. So that work is already being set up, if you like, in the background at the moment. At the moment, it's impossible to model because there are too many unknowns. But as soon as the UK-EU relationship is finalised, we can go ahead and model that work, and that information will be made available. But the trading relationship with the EU is not the only issue facing UK agriculture. We still foresee significant consolidation in the industry, in particular for those sectors relying on direct payments. It's not necessarily all of those small farmers, because a lot of the farm business income doesn't reflect the fact that a lot of farmers farm because of lifestyle choice, and they still continue to do that in New Zealand in the absence of subsidies. And a lot of farmers will have off-farm incomes, which again aren't reflected. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the whole sector is going to restructure, but it does mean that a significant proportion, if they're not in that top 25% of performers, and if they don't have a diversified or off-farm income, will find it increasingly difficult to make a living just from farming going forward. And the restricted access to labour, in particular for pigs, horticulture, dairy, sectors like that, will have a significant impact on those sectors, and that can't be underestimated. Although in many sectors you can begin to improve productivity, and research and development will aim to sort of replace labour, there are certain jobs in farming where labour simply can't be replaced, and the technology isn't there yet to completely replace the access that we've had to highly skilled, efficient EU workers over the past 40 years. Next slide, please. So a lot of information there in a very short space of time, and thank you for bearing with me. There's a huge amount of information and resources to help. I personally have been working on this for the last 4 years. My team have been working on it for the last 3 years or more, and it's constantly being updated. So the characteristics of top performers that I referred to in the discussion, the UK Global Tariff, what you need to do to prepare, it's all there on the website. We are gearing up on our website for a no trade deal Brexit, a no trade deal exit, should I say, and the latest government advice will be available on our website to save you having to trawl through several different websites to get the information that's applicable to agriculture. So you can use AHDB as the hub if you like to find out all the information that you need to find out. And then very swiftly, if a trade agreement is reached, we will be going on to model the effects of future trade agreements with those agricultural exporters, as I've said. So I'm going to stop there and hand back to Helen for the Q&A. Thank you for listening.
That's brilliant, Sarah. Thank you. As you said, a lot of information and an ever-changing platform at the moment. So thank you for taking us through those. A couple of questions have come through, but keep those questions coming through if you do think of them. So first question is, with regards to MP consultations and regulations, do you foresee us being able or be in a position where we can refuse imports under WTO on substandard welfare grounds on UK public morals? Or will this upset US and China trade agreements?
That's a really good question, and it gets right to the heart of some of these trade agreements. So there's several things going on there under WTO, and again on the website I've written a paper on the WTO and what we can and can't do according to UK rules. And you're quite right to mention the public morals argument there, because on the face of it, animal welfare comes under technical barriers to trade, TBTs, and under those barriers to trade, you're not allowed to discriminate against a product if it's not discernible in the end product. So I think there was a case about asbestos versus some other roofing material, and if the product is going to be used for the same thing at the end of it, you're not allowed to discriminate. That case then went to appellate, and they said because of the nature of asbestos, even though it was being used safely in the end product, you could discriminate. The same thing happened with seals. So I understand the seals that were killed inhumanely, the first ruling was that you couldn't discriminate against the products. I think they were coming from Greenland, against the Canadian seals that were killed humanely, or the other way around. I apologise if my memory is a little bit hazy on this. And then the argument went back to appellate, and they said actually it was a public moral. It outraged public decency to have the seals clubbed to death, and therefore you could discriminate against this method of killing, and the appeal was upheld. Now, what this means for trade with US producers or any other producers sending product to the UK. How does that translate? Well, the UK and the WTO take a slightly different approach to standards. So we take a sort of hazard-based approach, and we say that if there is a potential risk to human health, even though it hasn't been proven, like with the hormones, then we're going to ban it on the precautionary principle. We're not going to allow it in. I'm straying into SPSs here, actually, with hormones. It's slightly difficult to welfare. The WTO takes a risk-based approach, and it will go with the science. And at the moment, the ruling on hormones is that there isn't any evidence that they're damaging to human health, and therefore you have to offer a compensatory quota if you're going to keep them out. So with welfare, it's much more complicated because it's a subjective judgment. You can't judge how an animal has been raised in the end product. So if you like, the arguments about chlorine washed chicken are a euphemism for welfare, because what the UK producers are saying is that they're produced to much lower welfare standards, and therefore they're sprayed to reduce the contamination of Campylobacter and the other organisms that get into it as a result of those lower welfare standards. So in effect, the argument is about welfare, not about the chlorine, because we have our salads washed in that and nobody complains. So can we keep it out? Under WTO, the rules are very clear. And unless it's discernible in the end product, you can't. Okay, you can't legally, but of course we can as a nation, and the government has said very, very clearly that they will in government. But what it means is that we then lay ourselves open to an appeal at WTO, and if we lose that, if there are no solid grounds for keeping that product out, we have to offer a tariff rate quota in compensation. So say, for instance, we said, right, we're not having any chlorine washed chicken, but there was no science that said that and by the way, they're not chlorine, they're antibacterial washes. No major chicken exporters actually use chlorine in their washes, but that's a side point. If we say we're not having any antibacterial washes on our chicken, then we can ban it, but the WTO will say, right, you have to offer a tariff rate quota to non-bacterial washed chicken to the US for compensation. So what it means in effect is that when we're talking welfare standards, it's actually a red herring if we think that we can use welfare standards to keep product out. We can agree it within a free trade agreement, and we can say you can't send the stuff over to us that's produced to this standard or that. And if we negotiate it successfully, that's an agreement between two people, and it's got nothing to do with two nations. It's got nothing to do with the WTO. The WTO tend to stay out of bilateral agreements. But what it does mean is that the major agricultural exporters will be able to pivot their production systems to any welfare standard that we stipulate, and they'll still be able to do so, probably due to their economies of scale, at lower cost than UK producers. So they will meet our welfare standards within an FTA, and they will send us a product that adheres to whatever standards we decide to send, and they'll be able to do that and probably still undercut. The question is, will they do that? And that is a supply and demand question, and that's an economic question. At the moment, our analysis shows that, for instance, with beef and the US, they have more lucrative markets on their doorstep, and with chicken. So they're not going to fly it halfway across the world. They're not going to flood our market with beef on day one. There will be, if we reach an FTA, there will be high-end beef coming into restaurants here in the UK, and we can see it getting into food service fairly quickly. But probably the retailers and the confidence in the UK product will be maintained for some time. For instance, we've had cheaper beef from Ireland, but it hasn't decimated the UK production because consumers prefer the UK produce. But that's day one, and that's sort of year one and year two. And as we all know, trade deals are for life, not just for Brexit. And therefore, over the long run, a lot of things can change. If they do lose their East Asia market for whatever reason, at the moment there's a strong demand for protein out there, as we all know, because of African swine fever. If they do begin to lose those markets, the UK market will become more attractive. And let's make no bones about it. If they decide to put their sights on the UK market, the amount of money that the US government will put behind accessing a market, and the way that they will market the product, and the millions of pounds they will put behind it, if they decide to target the UK market, they can do so very efficiently, effectively and profitably. So sorry, that was a very long answer to your question, but I do hope it's answered.
No, that was brilliant, Sarah, and it just goes to show sort of how complex this issue of animal welfare is, and especially adding it to WTO versus nation agreements, etc. Very, very complex. Just very quickly, just want to squeeze one more question in, just in the last minute we've got here. So can you just succinctly give us an overview of some of the things that AHDB is doing to examine the impact of upcoming trade deals with the US, New Zealand and Australia?
Yes, definitely, and I'll make this short. We are focused. My team, the policy and economics team, are heavily focused at the moment on those 3 upcoming trade deals, where we have very good links with the stakeholders. We understand the stage of the negotiations, and we'll be putting out information that really directly compares the current patterns of trade. Where is all that product going at the moment? Who's buying it and at what price? What are our import prices? What are their export prices? Where is it likely to flow? We'll be looking very closely at their methods of production, and how they may differ from the UK, and also importantly their costs of production, and show where they may have an advantage, or where the UK may have an advantage in different products. And then we'll be looking at the actual modelling side, and we'll work out from the different scenarios that we will construct exactly how much product is likely to flow here in the UK, and how that is going to affect domestic prices. And then we'll be constructing model farms, and we'll be able to overlay those price changes onto the farm business income, to give farmers an idea of how that might affect their income, along with that reduction in direct payments. So we're working incredibly hard on that. We can't move forward on it until the EU-UK situation has been agreed, not the modelling side anyway, but there's a huge amount of, excuse my very ancient plumbing system there, it's just made a very funny sound. It won't be, that there's a huge amount of work going on at the moment about the cost of production and the patterns of trade and everything, and that will be available on the website very soon.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for both of those presentations. Sarah is going to stay with us for the rest of the webinar, just in case any other questions do come up, and we do have time at the end. But for now, thank you for those presentations, Sarah. Both have been really insightful and a real update. So we're going to move next on to a presentation from Hannah Clark, who is one of the livestock analysts from AHDB. Hannah is going to give us a markets overview for most of the sectors. Now Hannah's focus is sort of markets in the wake of COVID. So again, something that's very timely and very up to date. So I will hand over to Hannah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Helen, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the session this morning. Over the next 20 minutes or so, as Helen said, I'm going to be going through brief supply and demand outlooks for each of the sectors that we cover in market intelligence. So that's beef, lamb, pork, dairy, cereals and oilseeds, and potatoes. I'll cover the market situations as we stand now, and our forecast for the rest of the year. So hopefully this will be a useful session for you all to take away. We produced our forecasts as part of our wider agri market outlook in July, and I will say that they do assume continued trade with the EU. Obviously, we're still uncertain over that situation, as Sarah has covered this morning, but we'll be revisiting our forecasts as and when we know more. So just to kick off with beef then, and in the year to August, we've seen production up 2% on the same period last year, due to increases in slaughter of both prime and adult cattle. We've also seen an increased rate of heifer slaughter this year in particular, possibly due to decreases in the suckler herd, negating the need for replacements quite as much, and so this has allowed heifer slaughter to be elevated. There's also trends in sex semen, which is reducing the proportion of prime slaughtered cattle that are male. Looking ahead for the rest of the year, we'd originally forecast production this year to finish lower than last year, due to cattle population data showing that there were fewer prime animals close to slaughter age this year. But considering how production's gone so far, we are expecting to revise this up. We are still seeing tighter cattle population numbers in the data, and so this might limit slaughter numbers going forwards. We are also expecting long-term contraction in the suckler herd to continue for this year, which again may limit numbers going forwards. Next slide, please. Moving to the demand outlook for beef. Earlier in the year, when we first went into national lockdown, we saw problems with carcass value balance as more people were going out into retail, panic buying and buying low-priced mince, which did pressure carcass values at the time. We then saw increased retailer promotions on steak, and AHDB launched its AHDB launched its Make It Steak campaign, and we did see this improve returns, and the carcass balance issue largely faded away. This has also affected improved producer prices recently. Our estimates of Kantar data has shown that the large uplift in retail has been sustained, and this has offset losses in food service. So that's due to the closure of pubs and restaurants, etc., in the 6 months to August. However, we are expecting consumption to flatten off for the year overall as retail demand falls away from the peaks that we saw at the start of early lockdown. And there is some uncertainty over future demand, considering how more areas of the country are going back into regional lockdowns. And so we may see tight restrictions come back in. We are still seeing the tighter cattle numbers on the ground, which could limit numbers going forwards. Looking at international trade, then we've seen both imports and exports fall on the year, likely caused by a combination of lower food service demand domestically and for export, caused by COVID-19. We know that beef destined for retail is more likely to be home produced, whereas beef that's imported is more likely to go into the food service sector. And so this will also explain why we've seen imports fall like they have done. We're expecting trade to remain lower for the rest of the year. However, there is uncertainty over supply and demand going forwards. As I've said, we've still got this tighter cattle inventory that we're seeing in the data. But again, we also don't know how the increase of local lockdowns and regional COVID measures might affect demand going forwards, especially as we head towards Christmas, which is typically quite an important time for all the sectors that we cover. Next slide, please. Moving on to lamb, and we see the opposite picture. We've seen sheep meat production so far this year down 6%, as we've seen lower slaughter of both prime lambs and adult sheep. Carcass weights have also been slightly lighter this year, possibly due in part to the dry spring causing issues for grass growth, and strong prices recently caused by uplift in retail demand, possibly drawing lambs forward earlier with slightly less finish on them. Looking ahead, we'd originally forecast sheep meat production to be down 7% year on year. However, again, there is the potential for this estimate to be revised up. Lamb slaughter so far this year has been higher than anticipated, partly due to lambs coming forward early this year, as I mentioned, but also due to high prices, but also due to perhaps some uncertainty over the trading picture in the new year. We're expecting the lamb crop for 2020 to be largely similar on last year, reflecting a relatively stable breeding flock and fair conditions that we saw this year at lambing. However, we are expecting a little contraction in the breeding herd going forwards, in the breeding flock going forwards, with some uncertainty over Brexit, perhaps casting doubt over producers' future intentions to expand. Next slide, please. As for the demand outlook for lamb, despite peak lockdown landing over Easter this year, subsequent improvement in retail sales and takeaway volumes have pushed volumes up. I'll just wait for the slides to catch up, sorry. Have pushed total volumes up 2% year on year overall. However, as with beef, we are expecting consumption to flatten out for the year overall, especially with consumers. We're seeing them become more price conscious in the wake, understandably, in the wake of economic uncertainty caused by COVID-19 and recessionary behaviours that we're seeing come through amongst consumers. And generally, lamb struggles with consumers with perceptions upon price and flexibility. So that may limit demand going forward. Can we move to the next slide, please? Sorry. Looking at international trade, then, we've seen volumes lowered mainly due to lower product availability from New Zealand, but also high demand from China for protein caused by the outbreak of African swine fever, as Sarah's mentioned. Our exports are forecast to stay lower this year overall, in line with low production, as they tend to mirror production levels. And the lower demand on the continent that we've seen caused by COVID is likely to, well, could affect exports going forwards. Next slide, please. Turning to pork then, and production has seen similar uplift to that of beef in the first 8 months of the year. And this is due to a combination of increased clean pig kill, and also we've seen heavier weights come through. We tend to see pig carcass weights increase year on year anyway, reflecting improvements in genetics. But this year it's been particularly noticeable. And this is potentially being caused by some COVID disruption that we've heard reported amongst some processors, especially on cutting lines. As you know, staff are having to self-isolate and social distance, and so this is perhaps causing a little bottleneck and perhaps causing pigs to be rolled, and so adding to average weights. Looking at trade, we've seen volume. Oh, sorry, missed out there. We are expecting pork production to remain elevated this year, due to modest growth that we've seen in the breeding herd in the previous year, which we're expecting to continue. We've also seen improvements in sow productivity, which we're expecting to see more slaughter pigs come available for the rest of the year. Next slide, please. On the demand front for pork then, as with other proteins during lockdown, increases in retail sales have more than offset the losses in food service. And interestingly here, a lot of uplift has come from bacon and sausage. These categories have performed particularly well over this period, which is interesting because before these products were having a bit of a hard time in the media with regards to health, and they've been struggling of late with consumer perceptions of health. So it's interesting to see how consumer priorities have shifted during this uncertain time. As with the other proteins, we are expecting consumption to flatten out for the rest of the year as retail volumes again sort of slip away from the peaks we've seen earlier on during lockdown. However, pork is usually placed at a more competitive price point than other proteins, and so this may give it some advantage over others, especially as consumers become more price conscious. From a trade point of view, imports are expected to remain in decline for 2020 due to disruption for domestic demand due to COVID-19 measures, but also because of the high production that we're seeing. Pig meat is the only red meat to have seen growth in exports, and this has been boosted by the Chinese demand because of their ASF issue. We are expecting this to continue for some time, because it appears that COVID-19 has delayed the Chinese return to pig meat production levels, although they are planning on obviously getting back to and expanding their pork production in the future. Next slide, please. So now we'll move on to dairy. And back in the spring, when the pandemic caused much of the food service sector to close very quickly, a number of producers were asked to curb their milk production to help prevent an oversupply situation. As a result of this, we saw a muted spring flush, as you can see on the graph here, and production so far for the season is down 1.1% on the year. We're expecting production to remain below last season's levels for the rest of the season, essentially due to this lower spring peak, and there's also uncertainty over demand going forwards, especially going towards Christmas. The national picture for grass growth is also down on the year due to dry weather in the spring and also the heat wave in the summer, and so this may limit forage availability going forwards into the winter. Next slide, please. So the demand picture for dairy is one of overall lower domestic consumption due to lost food service demand. However, with other sectors, the picture of future lockdown is cast particular uncertainty over the forecasts. Dairy is quite highly reliant on out-of-home consumption on a milk equivalent basis, so thinking of coffee shops and places like that. And so how the pandemic is managed going forwards will be critical for how the market develops. Especially, as I said, as we move to Christmas, which is quite an important time for regional products such as Stilton, which will have been gearing up to the festive period for most of the year. From a trade point of view, global milk production is expected to grow slightly in 2020, but due to the pandemic's effect on the global economy, consumption is expected to remain dampened, and so this may cause a bit of a supply and demand imbalance, which could pressure our exports in the short term. But of course, helping to counterbalance this will be the speed at which the domestic economy returns to normal and how demand recovers on the continent and in our export destinations. So this will be critical in determining how the markets continue. Next slide, please. So now we're going to move on to arable, and I will say this isn't my typical area that I cover. So if there's any specific questions on arable and potatoes, I'm more than happy to take those away to my colleagues in the arable team. But we'll start with cereals and oilseeds, and after quite a challenging season, to say the least, we saw lower planted areas reported in most crops in our early planting surveys, particularly winter cropping of wheat and oilseed rape. And we've seen these come to fruition in DEFRA's provisional production numbers. While we saw a significant decrease in the area of winter barley planted, the area of spring barley has more than offset this. And so the barley crop is estimated to be 8.4 million tonnes this year, which is quite an impressive crop. Because of the lower area of wheat and oilseed rape, we are expecting imports to play a more important role in these markets next year, in the coming season. Looking towards next harvest, I understand from my colleagues in arable that historically when we've seen lower areas of winter crops, we've seen rebounds in these areas in the following season. However, obviously against this, we have ongoing issues and concerns with variable weather, and we've got continued pressure from pests and disease like blackgrass for wheat and cabbage stem flea beetle for rape, which could limit areas going forwards. Next slide, please. From a demand perspective for cereals and oilseeds, we've seen the closure of licensed venues, so pubs and bars and places like that, as a result of the pandemic, affect barley demand for brewers, maltsters and distillers. And we're expecting this to continue for a little while, especially as COVID measures continue and cases look like they're rising, and especially going towards the festive period, which is typically quite a good time for the alcohol industry. From a milling perspective, it seems that flour demand has been relatively stable, with the demand from retail and more people baking at home and cooking from home, offsetting losses from food service. The problem with the milling wheat picture is how much of the wheat crop this year is going to meet milling specifications, partly because of the lower area, but also there are concerns over quality this year in some regions due to the catchy weather that we've seen. Due to the lower availability of wheat, we are expecting barley and maize to play a more important part in animal feed production this year, especially as both are looking quite price competitive with wheat currently. From a trade perspective, as a result of harvest estimates, we're expecting the UK to be a net importer of wheat and a net key exporter of barley in the coming season. And as I said, we're expecting rape imports to play a more important part this year. Of course, there are risks to our trade from a tariff perspective, as Sarah's covered well this morning, and whether we get a trade deal with the EU or not. And this is a particular concern for barley this year, as we've got such a large exportable surplus. And this surplus could be affected by how demand in the hospitality sector returns to a more normal sort of situation. Next slide, please, carry on. So finally, I'll just cover off potatoes. From a supply point of view, our recent planted area estimates have shown that the GB planted area is down 2.3% on the year, with the majority of decline seen in the Midlands and northwest of the country. This is partly due to issues with weather in previous years, and parts of the country last year were very wet during fieldwork periods. And so from a sector point of view, we've also seen the decline mainly in the processing sector, which are potatoes mostly destined for food service, which has obviously been affected by the pandemic. Next slide, please. From the demand point of view for potatoes, as again with other sectors, we've seen food service hit the demand for the sector, in this case for processing potatoes. But because we've seen more people buying at retail and cooking from home, and perhaps looking for more budget-friendly ingredients, we've seen fresh potato volumes more than offset the losses from the retail sector. Especially, as I say, as the price point of fresh potatoes does provide some advantage. We have seen, as a result of the sort of shift in demand from retail to from food service to retail, we've seen a bit of a carcass balance issue, I call it, in potatoes, with those potatoes destined for food service being diverted for sale through retail at a lower price, and so this pressured markets a little bit at the time. From a trade point of view, before COVID hit, there were concerns of a shortfall between the 19 and 20 season on the continent. However, the closure of food service similar to the UK throughout the continent has debunked this somewhat. And there's reportedly now quite a large surplus on the continent now, which could weigh on our trade and prices going forwards. There's also uncertainty about whether, obviously, the trade situation with the EU, and as Sarah's mentioned, whether or not we achieve third country equivalence. And this is of particular concern to the potatoes sector for our seed exports, and whether these will be able to continue to meet phytosanitary regulations going forwards come the new year. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up the session, I appreciate we've covered a hell of a lot of ground there, and thank you very much for bearing with me. I just wanted to close by saying, uncertainty is still very present for all markets that we cover, not least because of COVID and how future cases will be managed and how future lockdowns might affect demand. But also, domestically and for export, but also regarding longer term issues that I've not even touched upon that Sarah covered this morning, around changes to farming policy and ongoing concerns with farm support and new trading relationships going forwards. I've included some links to some scenario work that our strategic insight team have done around coronavirus and exiting lockdown and how we might come past coronavirus. I've also included links to our short-term outlooks that I've covered today, and also a link to a longer-term view that we've produced for all sectors that discusses some of the wider and broader issues that we might face in a post-COVID world. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
That's lovely. Thank you, Hannah. As you said, quite a full-on presentation there with lots and lots of information. It's been really interesting to see how COVID has impacted some of our markets, and even more interesting potentially to see what happens over the next few months, especially around the Christmas period. So I have a couple of questions that have come in, but if anybody else has any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A session. So first question was really about any projections you have for meat demand going through the rest of the year, especially into Christmas.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and it's quite a difficult one to forecast, as you can imagine. From a consumption point of view, we have produced estimates. The retail team has produced estimates for how consumption is likely to go ahead, and it seems that it's likely to flatten out, because obviously we had peaks in retail demand when food service was first initially sort of closed down, and people were panic buying at retail, which really supported markets, especially for UK produced meat, which is more likely to go into retail. But since then, volumes have sort of come away a little bit. We did see the Eat Out to Help Out scheme come in August, which seemed largely positive for the sectors. But it seems like for food service, August might be as good as it gets. But as I say, we're heading towards Christmas now. Typically a very important time for red meat and dairy and all sectors, in fact. So yeah, it's uncertain. Will we be able to celebrate Christmas like we've done normally? Will we be able to have a family round? Will we still have the big roasts? It's really difficult to see. On the website, we do have coronavirus exit sort of scenario modelling that our retail team have done, and they sort of break down how we might exit lockdown into 3 different scenarios for sort of best case, middle case, and worst case. And it's sort of looking like now we might be, measures are starting to linger on, and we might be heading towards a more less positive outlook for how we might exit. So yeah, currently we are expecting demand to flatten out for the proteins, but it's a very fluid situation, and there's a lot of things that could affect this going forwards.
Brilliant, thank you, Hannah. And just one other question. You've put some web links within your presentation that will obviously be circulated, but are there any other resources that would be of use to our audience with regards to this topic from AHDB or elsewhere?
Yeah, so the links I included were to the short-term outlooks that we publish several times a year, that I touched upon this morning, and those will be updated probably in the new year for the coming year. I also put a link into the longer term view for each sector, that is more of a holistic, longer term view of how markets might move going forwards for a longer term picture, and that covers topics such as environmental support, so ELMS, how farm subsidy, how that situation will develop, and also some future trade, the picture of future trade and how that might change. From a coronavirus point of view, the retail and insight team in market intelligence have done lots of analysis on the situation and how it's affected different categories that we cover. So there's all sorts of information on there that will be really useful to read. And we've also got the more work coming forwards for Brexit, which will be available on our website for everyone to have a look at. So there's lots to go at.
Brilliant. Just one last question before we look to wrap up. It was regarding any evidence we've got or information on locally sourced foods, and whether that has, the ramp up has been sustained, and what we feel the trend might be going forward. Is that something that your team focuses on, Hannah, or is able to focus on?
So for local food and the focus on British, that would be something that the retail and consumer team in market intelligence would cover. They do track consumer attitudes towards things like prevalence and traceability, and British food is becoming more important, and I think it's really become more important to consumers, especially during the pandemic, when perhaps we saw empty shelves. And so people have looked elsewhere more locally to source their food. We've seen a real spike in visits to butchers. So yeah, that will be something that the retail and consumer team would focus on. But as I said, there's lots of information on our website, and I'm more than happy to go and dig out some stuff if that's of any use.
That's brilliant. Thank you ever so much. Right, we're just getting up to 11:30 now, so we'd just like to thank both of our speakers. Thank you very much, Sarah and Hannah, for brilliant presentations, and for taking the questions and answering them so fully. So thank you for that. We have also had some technical support behind the scenes, so I'd like to thank everyone that supported the webinar as well from AHDB, and has meant that I haven't had to do 16 jobs at once, so that's been very important to me. Just wanted to focus on a couple of other resources that we have available. So one that Sarah mentioned earlier was the Horizon resource series. So please keep your eyes out for those. There are a number of those already available, and will be more coming out quite soon, obviously focusing highly on Brexit, etc. Also, we do have some FAQs email addresses, one that is specific for COVID and one that will soon be live specific to Brexit. So if you, all the students, do have any specific questions regarding COVID or Brexit that they would like to ask AHDB staff, those will be available. Well, the COVID one is available now, and Brexit one quite soon. Thank you to everyone who's put in questions today. Really appreciate sort of the engagement that's been coming along. There is also, as I mentioned at the beginning, the feedback survey that will hopefully come on your screen when we end the webinar, but also will be emailed out to you. So the emails, you will be contacted probably in the next 2 to 3 days with all of the links to all of the videos from the webinar series, as well as the summary slides and some further handouts. So those will be circulated to you in the next 2 to 3 days. Everything will be uploaded onto YouTube, so that will be easily accessible, no sign-ins or logins needed, etc. The presentations, as I said, will be emailed out. So if you do want to use any of the information, then please do, but also use the links to go to our webinar for the most up-to-date information. Obviously, these are a snapshot of the time that they were presented, so please check the AHDB webinar for the most up-to-date information. That's everything that I had to cover. So thank you ever so much for everyone joining. As I said, there are 3 others, one this afternoon on livestock, tomorrow morning on Arable, and tomorrow afternoon focusing on business. If you haven't registered, please do, or get more of your colleagues to sign up as well, so that we can make sure that as many of the lecturing sort of audience are able to access all the information that's coming through. Please do fill back on the feedback forms. That's where we really get your feedback in terms of what we've done, the relevance of it, and what you'd like us to do next. Fingers crossed we will be able to have a physical face-to-face later next year, but who knows? So your feedback is absolutely needed so that we can prepare something that is relevant to you. So thank you very much, and hope to see you all over the next 2 days. Many thanks. Bye-bye.